Chromebook. You go ahead and do that. And then when you say, Miss, I don't got this done, can I do what you know? Sorry, I already did it. And I did it with my two other children and you decided not to. So and usually after I say something like that, they're like,
oh, there we go.
And usually after I say something like that, they're like,
oh, there we go. Oh, that is like. Maybe this room's got this really weird echo in here. Oh, let's share my desktop. There we go. Okay, so let's get started here. How's everyone doing?
Good.
All right, so I know I asked the question already, but since there's more people in the room now, maybe we'll just go around the room and say really quick, just one thing that we'll just do this. One thing you really like about JavaScript module so far, and one thing you're struggling with. And then we'll see if we can alleviate any issues there.
Module 4 as a whole, or
as a whole, right? So if there's one thing that you're doing well with and one thing that you're struggling with. So you want to start over here?
I hope I'm doing well. I feel like sometimes I'm really lost. But then like when I actually start to like code and do stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, I was on the right track. But sometimes I feel like I'm repeating, like I'm constantly doing for loops, and I feel like maybe that's not correct. But I don't really know. So I think I'm trying to figure it out.
Gotcha. So that could be just a situational thing where maybe the for loop isn't as efficient as something else, right? So, and that just could be when you get to an issue where how should I iterate over this thing? Maybe it's just a matter of knowing all the options and trying to figure out which one works the best. And we come across this situation where you're like, hey, this is a situation. Let's go through that. But definitely, yeah. But that a lot of times it's like, it just comes down to efficiency. Like what's the most efficient way to do it? And that just comes with time. Yep.
I would say the same. It's right now, like the past 2 weeks, studying JavaScript, started off with auto care, but then kind of went downhill from there. But now it's picking up again, so it's kind of like that, up and down. But so far, I like what we're doing right now. Like,
It's good. Cool. Awesome.
I think my biggest struggle with JavaScript is trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B. But I was looking at most of the developer network last night, and I think that's really good for me to use because I just don't know where to start. So I think that just looking at it will help figure out how to write functions to do what I want to do.
Right. And a lot of times it's, what does this function accept? Right. You don't know sometimes, right? So you got to look it up and
Most of the developer network that we went over. Okay. What I think I'm doing well, or what we like about the module as a whole. Yeah. I like. I think my own answer. I was gonna answer personally.
Well, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if you can answer for everyone else, unless you want to go around the room and answer for them else.
I don't even know well understanding conceptually, but then like it's saying about the practice part. The module as a whole, what I don't like so much many topics in one class. You have to try to separate them and figure what they are, figure out what they are separately, which is kind of
I like to, that is in code every class.
Good, good. Yeah, it's JavaScript allows you, and most languages do allow you to take little bits and pieces and solve them first and then bring them in. Okay, so that like last week when you guys talked about modules, like that sort of approach, like this modular approach to things. Solve little problems here and there until eventually you solve the whole. Sometimes that helps too. I hope that answers your, well, it addresses that concern as well.
All right, so this whole module has been pretty tough for me, and I'm not used to that. I'm not used to be able to learn things pretty quickly, so it's been frustrating. I think my biggest struggle is like, well, I really like being able to like incorporate very dynamic pieces into like apps and sites. So I think it's really cool. You can do like a crap ton of stuff, which is awesome. The hardest part for me is like literally remembering what to do when. Like I feel like I know all the little bits and pieces, but I can't remember the sequence of like the syntax of like how to put them all together to make it work. Like I keep mixing things up, or like reversing things, or like putting them in the wrong spots. So like that's been really tough, and it's like I've been trying to practice, like keep practicing, like just write random for loops or like stuff like that. But I think that's been the biggest struggle.
The order in which you're putting it in.
Yeah,
Yep.
like what am I doing? Like I know what I want it to do, but then like how do I put it in the right order so it doesn't want it to do?
Right. That's unfortunately that's another thing that comes with time and practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But otherwise, like it's been really cool to see. Like I'm excited to see like other ways that we can like continue. At first, it was like super abstract and like
Right.
it literally made no sense. I was like, what are you even talking about at all? So I was pretty lost for a couple classes here and there. Also,
Understandable.
Like Anna said, it's kind of like up and down. Like I have really, really good like bits verse of like stuff where I get it, and then there's like what so yeah.
I feel you there. I was the same way. I started. I'm like, what am I doing? Why is yeah. We skipped over Elizabeth. You wanna?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
No.
She's over in the loading dock over there.
I gotta tell someone, it's like super in front of like a dumpster. Not good. Are we recording?
We're live. Yep. You want to come back? Let's come back to you. Okay.
Please.
Kelly?
Okay, I made a list in sticky notes so I remember what I wanted to say. So the things I've liked so far about JavaScript are being able to learn and integrate some new concepts and kind of start to get a bigger picture of how a website is built. I like being able to kind of read the language in the sense that now there's more complicated things I can look at, and even if I don't understand the whole thing, I can at least get parts of it and pieces and be like, okay, I know what this does, I know what this does, and tie it together. So that part's been really fun. And I also like making things in JavaScript, like making buttons or lists or things like that. It's kind of cool to see it published to the website. So that part's been fun. My 3 pain points. So this is just a personal thing, but I wasn't very good at math in school. And so seeing all these like word problems just freaks me out a little bit, just like is my thing. I read the paragraph and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how to do that. What are you asking me? I know that's just a thing I have to get over. It'll help if I start making myself full notes and stuff like that. It's just like weird thing keeps happening. I'm going to echo Caitlin's frustration that like HTML and CSS were a challenge for me, but they were fun compared to JavaScript, where I could just like throw my hands up in the air and then like, what? What are you asking me to do? I don't understand what this is. What are you saying? So it has been frustrating. Also, small pain point with this class, and Jesse can hear this if he's listening. There's no way we're going to learn regex in a day. There's just no way we can do that.
Right, and I think the
yes,
more of the so more of the intention behind this module is it's the introduction to JavaScript, right? So a lot of that stuff, now that you've been introduced to it, now it's time to like practice it, right? Until it starts to make sense and ask more questions and stuff like that. It's tough. It's 4 weeks of only 4 days of JavaScript, right? And that's, you know, when I was first learning JavaScript, it wasn't 12 days or 16 days. It was 2 years worth of all these efforts, right? But I didn't have instructors. I didn't have any of that, right? So I was all, you know, part-time in my basement when I was tired and exhausted at home and just, you know, trying to figure this stuff out. So you've got the advantage there. But I do hear you. It's a lot to go through and it's a lot to process. And it's really practice. And eventually you'll be like, oh, regex, that's so easy. Not really. I don't remember half of regex, to be honest with you, but that's why we have resources available. There's not a single day that goes past that me and all my coworkers Google stuff. It's just, yeah. No one can remember everything. Right? So don't feel too bad. And you had a third?
Oh, that was 3.
Oh, that was 3. Sorry, my math was off on that too. So, okay.
I think I want to share with the class at the same time because I was struggling with these traumatized people. Weeks 2, 3, and 4. My mother died.
Oh, sorry.
Has been both good, but I'm behind. I get no breaks. I was told no breaks, so I'm doing my best. I'm just brushing the picture and everything. And since I was there, even though we're recording, might as well put it out there. I do like JavaScript. It's been a rough year, weeks.
Yeah.
But JavaScript seems just in general so much in a short period of time, and I'm still loving just the basics, reading elegant. Is it eloquent or elegant?
Eloquent, yes.
Eloquent, oh, thank you. Yeah, just taking notes and just, you know, going over more the conceptual. Because it's soothing. It's a different side of my brain completely. So is this, but also the
Right.
conceptual stuff. And I'm not struggling, very similar to what Dick here expressed, that conceptually, then, you know, doing it.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm going back to crying now.
Oh. Okay. Well, in addition to the eloquent JavaScript book, I'm going to share another resource by another author who does a really great job of just saying it in like what I call plain English, right? So does a really good job of explaining that stuff, and I'll go into some of the resources as well. That'll probably help for everyone. In fact, I love this stuff so much that I bought print versions, even though you can just view it for free online. But I just wanted to support him. So thank you. Yeah.
You need classrooms. And I don't know. I put in there stuff that I never done.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for the safety.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Karen.
Okay, what do I like? I mean, I guess for me, what I like about JavaScript is I can understand it. When we started talking, you know, when Max was doing functions and all that stuff, I thought, oh, okay, I get all that. And I don't know, and I think for me, it was because I had taken a logic class. That helped me. Where my biggest struggle is actually coding it. I'm lost way into that. And then I get frustrated, and then I have to walk away, and then I don't finish it, and then I'm like, oh my God. And then I feel like I'm just explode because I can't get it. I know what I want it to do.
Right.
But it's getting from point A to point B to point C, like, oh, maybe it works. So that's my my biggest thing, I think, is just getting it to work. Getting it to kind of coding.
Right. So I'm going to keep, this seems to be a similar like theme to like the struggling part. So I'll keep that in mind, and I'll try to come up with ways for us to get more of the basics like down, right? And so that we know that we have a good baseline of, okay, maybe I don't know exactly what to write yet, but I have a good way to start. And so if we structure some more, so even with like, I mean, I have some stuff that's already for today that I've always was planning on talking about, and we'll still go over that. But maybe for tomorrow, I'll try to come up with some stuff that will
Yeah, I mean-
kind of like bring us all up a little bit, a little level.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, I asked for resources, I knew last week, I was like, I need resources, like extra, so that I can look at on my own, I looked at YouTube videos, I have like 3 books now, so that I can kind of go through and look at them. I don't care, I mean, I like the books, but that's just me.
Right. Everyone learns a little bit different. Yep. Cool.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
What do we like and what do we not like about the JavaScript?
What do we like and what are we struggling with?
What are we, okay. So, I'll start with, what I like. I like that yesterday you mentioned to look for the patterns within the coding, and it's something that I'd always thought about in the back of my mind. I'm like, these while loops seem to follow a certain type of pattern. So to hear you actually like validate what I was thinking, very cool. I like that you introduced us to Scratch.js because I like learning about new tools that we can help us with coding. And the things that I struggle with, the JavaScript syntax. A lot of times when I know the information that I want to put together, sometimes I have trouble figuring out if it should go inside, the parentheses with a semicolon at the end or not at the end. And I think I have a better handle on that today because I realized it was a problem, so I'm just setting up on it. I struggle when we're asked to present code or formulate code, and there is no natural language explanation or pseudocode to go along with it. I would like to see more use of a natural language explanation or pseudocode so that we can begin to look at how we, via language that we already speak, which is the English language, should be breaking this down as we approach a project. Yesterday, I did ask that you insert comments. I like to see things as logical chunks, and sometimes when there's a lot of code, if the comments aren't there because I'm still new, it just looks like a bunch of mumbo jumbo to me. So when the comments are there, I'm actually able to just focus and say, oh yeah, this part is supposed to do this, and then that helps me with my own coding. And the other thing that I struggle with sometimes, I like to go back to the PowerPoint just to see what I'm missing. And when there's no example code within the PowerPoint, when it's just like all outlined without anything, that has to do with the homework to go with it, I'm like, okay, now I'm gonna have to go to this resource and that resource. And we have a lot of resources,
Right.
but I usually like to start with the PowerPoints to see some example code within it. So,
Okay. I actually don't like using PowerPoint. I use it mostly as like a reminder of what I want to talk about next, as a general gist of it. But I think as we go through these different, I have basic slides set up, but maybe as we talk about things, I'll just make sure I save the code snippets
right,
into
because
it.
in previous modules, the instructors made sure to put example code in for us
Gotcha,
to follow.
gotcha.
And I think yesterday was probably one of the first times that there was no example code, and so.
I failed you.
I'm
sorry.
I wanted to mention it.
Sure. No, I could do more of that. No, anything to help, anything to help you guys.
Jesse always says, well, you're the first core host, so you gotta speak up. So, we've been invited to speak up for that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, my day-to-day, it's rare that I ever touch a PowerPoint or slides, so.
Well, we get PowerPoints all the time, and I don't know, if most of the time there is example code within our PowerPoints, at least that's what I've seen.
We could definitely add more in.
Okay.
So as we go through things and show examples, I'll make sure I paste them in. Yeah.
I was struggling yesterday just or trying to get the screen like console at the bottom of it and keeping none of it get behind and
Okay,
This
Oh.
me.
gotcha.
harder.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I remember you asking the question I wanted to, which was, how do you get that? It was like, yes.
Yeah. So like a frequent theme is like you know, when you're typing and we're trying to type with you, a lot of times I just stop because it's not even worth it. I look down and look back up and sometimes everything has changed and I'm like, whoa.
I had to too yesterday. I didn't want to I was trying to get the help I needed from.
Gotcha, gotcha.
No, I don't think I'm being lazy, but you know,
No,
so sometimes we need to, okay, this is the time where I stop for like a minute and hurry up and type as fast as you can.
You
and
either
then,
interrupt the
you know,
entire class or give up, like.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think I
Okay.
just need to know that when I look back up from typing, that I'm confident that what you have there when I look down is still gonna be up there when I look up. And so I stopped because I realized this is a boot camp and we just need to flow or we'll probably never get anything done. So I just rely on being able to go back at another time and just piece it together. I just choose not to type most of the time.
Gotcha. Okay. Take all this into consideration. So what, no, I'm serious. But like, I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right tools necessary for at least what I'm presenting, right? So more code snippets, or at least what we go over today, I'll paste into the slides so they're saved. Did anyone try accessing those slides? The slide that I posted?
Yesterday,
Yeah.
I had them open during when we were teaching.
It did. Oh, okay. Because I got this weird like invitation to like share it. I was like, is someone trying to access it that didn't have access? And I didn't want to just give it to some random email address I've never seen before. So with that, let me open up.
And then like maybe even when you're doing the Scratch JS, maybe even some screenshots. So because you are working through two different.
Oh, right. I'll have to remember how to do screenshots in here. Command Shift 4, I think.
Yeah, Command Shift 4, Command Option 4. Command Shift 4.
All right. We will open up. I'm just gonna open up real quick.
Just put those babies right in the slide.
It brings up this little thing that you can actually click and drag down. Yeah, so then you can actually click and drag, so like if you don't want your whole screen, if you don't want, it's almost like.
Nope, not that one. Nope, I don't have that open. Hold on. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about event handling today. It relates to the event handling. So yesterday we went over DOM manipulation, but we went over kind of like the static stuff, right? So well, here's an element, we can inject it into the DOM, we can manipulate it. But what about when a user interacts with it, right? So if it's just a paragraph, they can highlight it and copy and paste, and that's great. But what about buttons or inputs or anything like that? There's events that are associated with that sort of user interaction, and that's what we're going to go over a little bit today. And I also want to cover another method of iteration, which you're going to see often in the future. Doesn't mean you have to master it right away, but you will see this, especially when we get to like the module 11 stuff. You'll see it more and more and more. So I want to introduce it to you, so it's not like a shock, like, oh, what's this thing, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit about that. And then I copy this. State. And then in students, apologize for the lack of. Oh, no. Okay. Oh, this is just I'm just pasting the slides real quick. All right. So I guess what I'll do before I start with event handling, I'm going to introduce this iteration method, and then we'll go into event handling. Right after that, I'm going to just introduce it, and then we'll come back to it again later. Just to
Did
kind of.
anyone else get something saying that you need permission to access the Google Slides?
Oh.
You didn't give us unapproved access.
Interesting. Okay. just kept that open. Okay. Let's try this one.
Great, come on in.
In, okay. Better, good. Okay. Done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up just a blank here and go back to our Scratch real quick. So if we open up your dev tools, Command Option J. It could be any page, preferably one that doesn't refresh every so, or try to do all these Ajax calls every so often. Just a about blank is good.
Just any website.
It could just be the Google homepage. It could just be really any site. We just want to get back to that tool. So let me just thumbs up when you're there.
Streaming?
Good, good.
Yes, start
Yep.
streaming?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to bring that up.
Okay. Everyone can see this okay? Do I need to increase font size?
Yes.
Is this better?
Yeah.
You can bring it down. so.
Could be a new tab or a new window.
You want to put the new that new window. Yeah, new window, thank you.
Oh, okay.
It's not bad, well, it's not for me.
So the method I want to, so what yesterday we used, what did we use? Did we use a for loop? We used a for loop and a for each. I think we mostly used for each. So if we kind of revisit that real quick. So let's say I just have my array, just ARR, and we'll just have something generic.
Can you make it a little bigger?
A little bigger. Better? Okay. I'm running out of room on my screen. Hopefully it shows up okay. That's kind of the necessary evils with that. Well, actually before, yeah, so we have, this is just an example code. So we know that arrays have a for each method. And when we call for each, it expects us to pass in a function. So if you remember, this function gets passed 2 arguments. Believe it technically gets passed 3, but we'll only worry about the first 2. So the first, anyone remember what the first argument passed in is? No? So the first argument is the element that we're iterating over. So in this case, if I were to call for each on this, the first time it's called, 1 is passed in to element. The second time, 2 is passed in to element. And the third time, 3. So for each one, it's going to go for exactly what it says. For each one of these, this function will be called. The first parameter is the element. The second one is the index of where that element exists in that array. So let me make this a little bit easier to think about. With numbers and indexes, it gets kind of confusing. So when this gets called the first time, A gets passed into here, and index gets assigned where that position is in the array, which the first one is 0. So this would be A, 0, next time is B, 1, and then C, 2.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in other programming languages, you can't put element there unless you like define it somewhere. Here
Right.
it's not defined, so it just
Let's
goes-
touch on that. So when we actually declare a function, so if I say function, my function, right? So this is something that's a little bit confusing
Yeah,
overall.
I asked yesterday and I kind of got it, but
Okay. So if I say arg1, arg2, what I'm doing here is I'm declaring this function. And inside this function, I have access to local variables that are only inside that function, right? So I define those variables here. So this actually is a variable
like a 2
declaration,
and 1.
right? So you can think of it like this.
Just like saying that.
It's like saying that, but it's only valid within this function, right? So that is actually just like a local variable declaration. We're just giving it a name. So we have something to, so when we pass values into the function, we can reference it by this particular name.
And so how does it know that the first one is it, like the first one is an element and the second one is index? Can you switch that? Or do you have to? say-
For each mandates that you give it that in that order,
So it's-
right? That's part of the implementation of for each, right?
there's like a
So
template that you're following.
Yeah.
Whenever you make a for each.
yes, there's a pattern to it, right? It's the pattern. So for each always gets passed. When you give it the function, that function will always get passed the element first and the index second. That way we know that every time we call for each, we know for a fact we can write that function the same way and expect the same results. It'll never be different than that, right? So it's the same way that I'm declaring my function up here with arg1 and arg2. When I call this function, the first thing I pass into it will go to arg1. It'll never go to another position in here, right? So it's just part of like that function's signature, right? You know that for each takes a function that has 2 arguments, and they'll always be passed those arguments in that order all the time.
Okay, so on that, on line number 1, that's your function with the 2 arguments.
Yes.
And then on line 5.
Line 5 is like a separate code snippet, right?
and
So
are you just declaring, you're declaring ARR?
function declaration, oops, with 2 local variable declarations. That is exactly what's happening.
I still don't understand the argument and then the index. Can we just use the element to and like when you do the for loop, you find and then you use the for loop to find the index position of the element. That is the passing it an index.
Well, for each will pass you the index. For each gives it to you. So all we're doing is, this is what's called that callback function. So every time for each says, okay, this first element in this array, I'm going to take the element and index it that it's at. And if you pass me a function, I will throw them into that function.
What do you mean by
The index. So what I mean there is that this array here has 3 elements, and each one is given a number that represents its position in the array. That's the index of that particular element. So
And our indexes always start with 0.
indexes
right?
always start with 0. So it's a zero-based indexing array. So you have, so if I were to say ARR index 0, that's the same thing as getting out the value A.
So the index is just you passing it, whatever you passing it, the argument to the function of the place that you want to be the element to go.
Yes. So this is the element. Yep. Let's label it this way, because we can call this anything we want. It's just always going to pass the index as the second one. So we could actually call it element position inside, right? We can give this whatever name we need to, but it will always be passed the same type of value, right? So it'll always be past the index, but if it helps you to think about what that actually represents, we can give it this name. So this is the element position. Does that help?
Yeah. I mean, I was just a little confused with this with when we did the indexing, we use the for loop and then we use the brackets to just like basically tell it where to go. So I was just.
Oh, so let's see. So let's say we'll say var I equals 0. And then, oops. If I, let's say is less than 10, and then I plus plus, and then you do this,
Yeah.
right? So this is a generic loop, right? So if I have an array, let's say I still have, let me move this out of this screen so we only see this one. So this is a generic loop. And then we'll say var. Whoa. We'll just use, well, we'll say first, second. Yes, this is actually good. We'll go over the difference here. This will help your understanding. So we have an array of 3 strings, first, second, third. And I want to loop over this array, right? So I create a for loop. I start with, we'll just say is less than, if I is less than 3. So we would say A or ARR, and then use I to grab the value, right? So if I were to say, have you guys used console log yet? Okay, so if I were to console log this out, I would see 3 console logs, first, second, third, because I know that at this point in time, I is equal to 0, so I get this one. Then it's equal to 2, so I get this one, or 1, and then 2, and then it gets this one, right? So we're just saying, I want to loop over something. I have control over which index I want to pull out, right? So you're doing it from kind of the outside looking in. It's like, I see that thing over there, I want to loop over it. Whereas this is actually, what would we just call this? This is a method, this is a loop method available on the array, right? So the array type is this like special object with these indexes. It's an object, but it's this, it's an iterable object, which means you can loop over it. Just like here, it has an index, so we know how to access the elements by the index number. Whereas here, when we say for each, this is kind of like an abstraction over the for loop, except what we're doing is the array, you can kind of think of it like the array is saying, okay, I'm that for each over there, I'm going to keep giving it elements and the index of where that element is. But the method is called on that array object. That array object has a method built into it. Whereas the for loop is saying, I'm just going to loop over whatever's in here, whatever I tell it to, and pull out whatever I decide. Whereas array.forEach, it's going to go through every single element of that array and give you the information instead of you requesting it.
Can you put that in the comment that it's giving to, you said it's giving to the array as opposed to
Yep.
pulling out what it wants from based on the index?
Yeah, this helps. Yep. So array gives for each, oops, fro, for each every element and index. Are, how do I put that? Let's say you decide which element index to pull out.
So
Right, so you're deciding that.
with the for loop, it's more generic. And then
Yes.
it's just like going and specifically tell it to get.
Yes, and for, I'm sorry, Oh. this,
Yes, thank you.
Yep. I'm getting both on screen. Almost all the way. So with the for loop, it's generic in the sense that you can loop over things that maybe are not arrays. Maybe they're similar to arrays and you can iterate over them. Kind of like that HTML collection that we saw yesterday with like the 237 elements. That's an array-like structure, but it's iterable, which means a for loop would be able to go through it because it has an index. Whereas that might not have a for each method available on itself. right? So for is kind of like a way of generically going over something, and it doesn't have to pull indexes out at all. You can just use a for loop as like a counter. So if I starts at 1, but I is less than 101, console log I, and you'll get in the log 100 logs that say 1 through 100, right? So for is just a generic way of saying, hey, I want to do this many times, whatever it happens to be. Whereas for each is a very specific type of loop. You're looping over the thing that you want to grab stuff out
So
of.
you already know what you want to grab.
Yes, you already know that it's an array. You know it's got these elements in it. You just want to go through everyone without thinking about how long it is, right? Because that, or for each, you don't have to tell it when to stop. It just goes through the entire thing. So you don't have to know ahead of time if it's 3 elements, if it's 100 elements, it doesn't matter. It'll just give you them all, right? Does that help with the different levels? Okay. All right, so for each. So when we loop over for each, we get the element and the element position, and then we can decide what we want to do with it. So there's another way to iterate over. Actually, if I just say, just as to put the example in there, element, position, just as an example, this would say, you know, A 0 and then B 1, etc. Right, so that's what you'll see every time it loops over. Now this other method of iteration is very similar to for each, and that's called map. We'll set up another. I don't want to keep using the same AR again, but I guess it's fine. But this time we'll do, well, I guess it doesn't matter. They're just elements. We have this array, and we have array.map. It's a similar thing to for each, where it takes a function. That function gets past the element and the element position. Same pattern. You're going to see this pattern a lot. Now, with for each, you decide what happens. It doesn't return anything. It's what's that void function that we talked about earlier, where it doesn't give you anything back at the end. Like you're not assigning. You wouldn't say like new array equals the result of calling for each. It just doesn't happen. Array for each it just doesn't give you anything back. You decide what happens. Whereas map will return a brand new array with whatever you did on those elements every time you loop over it.
So what's the point of having a for function that doesn't return anything?
If you don't need to return anything, let's say you want to just loop over a bunch of things on the page, and maybe just, or let's say you have an array of buttons that you want to create, right? So you could say for each one of these buttons, inject it into the DOM, right? You don't need anything back. The result is that you did something with it,
So
right?
it's giving an instruction, but you don't expect.
Yes, yeah. It's like if I said, okay, I have this list of things for you to do. I need you to go to the gas station, put gas in the car, go to the store, do these things, right? You're gonna go out and do those things. I don't necessarily need anything back from that other than those things are now completed. So if you could think about it that way. It's just a list of things that you need to get done, but you're not gonna like hold some value at the end of it. Whereas map is different in that it's the same and it's different. It's the same that you are looping over every single element in the array. It's not going to skip anything. It's going to go through the whole thing. But what you get back is a new array. And then the elements that are inside that new array, the elements that are inside that array are the result of what you did to each element, right? So in that case, we have to return some sort of value in here. So we have to have some sort of return. Even if we're doing just returning the element itself, that will actually, that's valid. It's not useful, but it's not that's not totally false. But it's not really helpful in this case. So I'm going to get back a new array of 12, 24, and 48. I already had that. That doesn't make any difference. But what if I needed to make a calculation on each one of these things, and I wanted to have a new array of all the new calculations? So I could say, instead of return element, I could say return element times 2. And the result of that, would I get back an array of 24, 48, and 96. So that's the array I get back. I get the new calculated values as they are in the positions that they originally were, right? So I know if I pass in an array, or if I have an array of 3 elements, I'm going to get an array of 3 elements back. A lot of times I'll see behavior, or not behavior, but different codes that I see in various places where people will map over something and treat it like a for each and not do anything with the return value. You can do that, but it's not really a great practice. So it kind of masks the intent of what you were trying to do. So if you're looking at your code 6 months from now and you're saying, oh, I'm mapping over this thing, I must be getting this new array, I'm doing something with the array, but it's not going anywhere. And then it's like, well, what? Use for each instead, right? So if you don't need something out of it, you just want things to happen, you can use a for loop, you can use for each, and just do it that way. Map is useful when you need to make calculations and then return something to use it later. And we'll see some of that as well today, later.
So I just want to code, and it's giving me 0, 1, 2.
Oh, can I see real quick? Just real quick. We're running the whole thing. And let me throw up just a quick example. If you could just follow along with this one. I'm going to comment.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
The right parent on line 31, does that have to be paired with something? I don't-
This?
So you have the ending curly bracket and then the green.
See how it highlights?
Yeah, so the right parentheses, is that paired with something?
Yes, it's paired with this one up here. So you could see some
Okay.
tools will do this for you, some won't. Visual
Oh,
Studio
I see.
Code will
Okay.
do it for you. You could see where the closing parentheses is. That's a useful feature in a lot of these IDEs and text editors, that if you highlight a parenthesis or a brace and you don't see something else highlighted, there's a reason why. There's no other highlight, right? You're missing a parenthesis or a brace. So let's actually run something and make some use out of this. So I'm going to comment out all the other stuff. We're not doing anything with this one, so you don't have to worry about that. So all I have here is I have an array, all these elements. I'm doing this thing here. Now, if I run this, oh, I'm not console logging anything. Let's do this. Let's say var new array equals the result of this thing. If I run this in the console, if I type new array, we'll see the result. So when you run the map, you were seeing the other result because you were console logging out the result of each for each. Map's not going to show you anything. It's going to return you something. So in order to actually see that, you need to assign that new array to like a variable or something, right? So that's why you weren't seeing anything. However, if I don't assign anything, and instead I console log, I'm also going to return, but I'll console log at the same time. And I run that, You see, it is making that calculation, but now I'm actually seeing what it's doing, right? You won't necessarily see the result of map. And 9 times out of 10, you're saving that into a variable to be used later, right? Maybe it's not a void function. It's actually returning you a new array. I've seen a lot of people treat it like a void function. And that's, like I said before, like the confusion comes in where you're looking at some code and saying, oh, I see they're using map here, so they must be using this array somewhere, and they're not. It's like, well, I don't understand what's happening here, right? So the functions that you use also indicates your intent, right? So if I see a for each, I know I'm not getting back something. I know it's kind of like what's called a side effect, right? Something else is happening because I'm running this for each loop, and that's okay, but I know the intent. Whereas if I see someone using map, my mind immediately goes to things, well, the intent of this to actually calculate something and get back a new array of these new calculations, right? Or concatenations or whatever you're doing with it. So just keep that in mind as you go forward. So when you see different methods and different functions, methods and functions I use interchangeably because of different languages I use at work. Their very nature indicates the intent that you want to have happen. And that'll come with time as you figure these things out.
So, if you're writing your code and you use a map function, and then farther down in your code, you can say, hey, now, you did this map function, well, that might not work in your way.
Yep, you could save it for later. And what's really interesting about things like map is that because it's returning you an array, you can do more array methods on top of your return value. So you can chain these things along and do lots of really complex calculations. We're not going to get too deep into that, but just know that because you're being returned an array, that array behaves like every other array. That also has a map function on it. That also has other methods. That also has a for each on it, right? So your map, the result you get back from map has a for each function built into it because the very nature of it being an array. Right, so just to illustrate, not that it's, I'm not going to get too deep into that, but I could say array.map, and when I get back, so everything between these parentheses, consider that as an expression that will resolve to a value, right? You're going to get back some, every time you see parentheses, basically you see an expression. And that expression should return you a value. And so we're going to map over that again. I'm going to do the same thing. And we're going to return element times 3 this time. So this is no longer going to be this, right? This is going to be something else. So we'll move this down to here. That's going to be a 3. So when I run this, so it took 12 times 2, then multiplied it by 3, right? So it took that same calculation, applied it over the whole array, except now that I've done it again, and I can keep doing that. I can chain it as many times as I want.
How would you, if you were to use it further down in your code, how would you call it?
Oh, good question. Let's do that. All right, let's go back to just this part, right? So all we have is we're mapping over this thing. We know that based on these values, this is what I should get back. So I will say new array. So now I have access to it in this variable. When this operation's done, it's going to take that new array, plop it in there. Now, farther down my code, farther down, actually, I believe it's technically further down for the grammar hounds in here.
We have bigger fish.
Gotta keep it light. All right, so I can now say console.log, say new array. Right, so I'm doing something with it, right? So now when I run this, I should see this in my output. Or maybe later on, I need to make another calculation. Now I can do something on top of that. Because what's inside new array is an array, and that array has methods on it, like map and for each. So I can do, so I have this calculation, and then maybe later on in my code, I need to maybe put those in the DOM at the same time I'm doing this other thing or whatever.
So would it make sense to comment this to say, new calculation based on results of previous array? I don't know if that makes sense.
We'll say return
Okay.
result results of map and place new array into new array variable. Right. New
Does that
array.
comment need to go under further down, or does it apply to that section right there? Because that's the initial calculation right there.
Right. So we're going to return. Yeah. So returning the calculated result of map, place it into a new array.
Okay. But then when we go.
Oh, down
further
here.
down, yeah, that's the one that I'm talking about.
We're going to log out the new calculated array.
Right.
Or whatever else you're doing with it.
I'm just thinking of a word that, see, that doesn't speak to me. Because the way that you said it was, when we start the new array down at the bottom, like if it's ×3, it's going to take, that's what I was talking
It
about.
takes the
when you
Oh.
last
say
calculation that you
right.
change. It doesn't take, like, it'll give you the final calculation. Because I just did it like that and you didn't do the last one.
Yep. The last operation performed.
Right.
When you
right,
chain things together, as long as you're returning something,
right.
because what's going to happen is these parentheses, and I can put a comment in
Right.
here.
No, I understand it,
Yep.
but I like the way that you explained it before.
Oh.
Now you're saying log out the new calculated array. I'm just saying that explanation does not speak to me. If I were to look back at this tonight to try to figure out what it is on my own, you actually explained it more like it took the values from the previous array and used the new calculation and spit out the new array.
Oh, that's when we chained it.
Okay,
Yeah. So if I were to chain on another map,
right.
right, it would take the calculations from the result of calling this map
Right.
and eventually put it in here.
Put it, right.
Yep.
Okay. That's what I was looking for.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can put it back in real quick.
Okay.
So we'll say map function element position.
Because that will help with the concept of chaining theories.
Sure. Yep. So below we are using chaining. And then we'll say return element ×3.
×3.
Now this,
Semicolon.
I've got to remember what this was. I don't know what this was, 72,
Yeah, it's 72.
188.
48 ×3, and then 96 ×3.
144.
There, I'll just run it. I'll just run
Oh,
it.
yeah. Bravo.
There we go.
Perfect.
So now we see the result. Okay, so that's what we see. Right,
And from there, if you wanted to, you could also map again. And have something else.
right here.
Yeah.
Yep. Or I can for each, or any other methods, or I could say, give me the third element,
In new.
index at index 2.
Yeah, so 0, 1.
Where you
So that'd be
Could you
2.
call it when, well, okay, so new array is a global, is that a global variable now?
It's in the global scope
Okay. so
because
like,
we
so-
haven't,
So that's why you can call it whatever.
right, because I'm within this particular, I'm in the same scope, if you will, right? I'm in the same area where this variable is valid.
So like you could call that and then manipulate it doing something completely different.
Yep, as long as you still have access to it.
Yeah.
Another way to pass that access out, you can read. So let's say you're inside a function, and inside that function you have this scope, right? Everything inside that's declared inside this function is only available there. But how do I get it outside? So one way to do that is to return the things you want to have access outside of there. So when that function gets called, those values get passed out and they can be used elsewhere. You can assign them to new variables. You can just utilize them right off the bat. Yep. And that's another concept we'll talk about on the final day of this week as well. But thank you for bringing that up. It's a very important point. We'll talk about scope and what you have access to, what you don't have access to. Did you guys talk about scope at all?
Yeah.
A little bit? With who? With Max? Okay, so he did talk about function scope, global scope. Okay, good. Good. We could talk about it a little bit more as well. All right, so I wanted, does everyone any questions on map or for each? So we're fairly good. Awesome. Map is one of those things where you either get it right away or it takes quite a while. So if we're at the point where we have a good understanding so far, that's awesome. Because understanding this pattern, you're going to see this pattern a lot, right? But once you understand it, you recognize the pattern, right? So it's kind of like when you're driving down the street, you recognize different patterns, right? I know for the fact that if I'm driving down this street, I can't park there. There's a pattern I'm looking for, right? On the side of the street. So it's when you recognize these different things, you're like, oh, I've seen that before. I know what to do. Maybe there's certain functions that you're not familiar with yet, but you know the intent. You know that when I see map, I know I'm getting back a new array, right?
Can you copy and paste this into Slack real quick?
Yes. Into Slack or into the slides?
Slack.
Slack.
Yeah.
Here. Into here?
It's like, I put out my disclaimer, I can't type and pay attention at the same
Gotcha.
time. So if you put the code there and I can grab it, that will help me with moving up to the next concept.
And it's like, what's line finding an object. JavaScript.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The dollar sign is to identify an object, right?
The dollar sign?
Yeah.
No. Where was I?
We've seen it, like somebody used it.
This.
No, it's a dollar sign.
Oh, a symbol?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I never use symbols. But that's what that is. So it's like a unique value. Oh, okay. I think I know what you're saying. Was it inside like a string of text? And
Yeah.
okay, in that case, what it is, that's it's called string interpolation, where you can inject the values within variables into the string. Instead of concatenating a bunch of strings together, you can just say, this is my string, plop the values in here. Did Max go over that? I think he would have done. Okay. We're actually going to talk about that specifically tomorrow, actually. So we will come to that. All right, so
And
JavaScript.
this is different than map object, right? Those are two
I'm sorry, can you?
like map object in JavaScript.
So a mapped object.
This is different, right?
So object doesn't have map.
It's
So,
not dot map. Like,
oh, dot map?
no, this is dot map, but I'm talking about like can't use, isn't there another map that you can use? But it's different. It's an
Object.keys, what we did
Yeah,
yesterday.
it has to do with keys, but
Yep.
it's- okay. This is different.
Yeah, so the object itself,
Do you know what I'm
um,
talking about? Do you remember?
Yeah,
Kinda
just
like-
looked it up. We did like a new map.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was a capital M map.
oh, that's the like the constructor for
Mhm,
the
yeah.
map. Yep. Yeah, that's a little bit different.
Yeah, no, that's,
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify because my brain was like. thinking
No, the
about
map we're
it's not
talking
the
about
same.
is the function that's available to all arrays.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Got it. I just didn't want to be confused later.
Oh, no, that's fine.
What is this? Why is this the same word?
A bunch of different languages use that word. Some of them are a little bit different than others. Let's see. All right, so we've got this here. So we're good on for each and map for now, right? Excellent. So we're going to talk about, I wanted to make sure I get that out of the way because we will see it on the second half of today briefly, but I wanted to make sure you knew what that meant. All right, so now that we have that, we can get rid of this, we can clear this. Oops. So let's talk about event handling. So as it relates to, we'll talk about it as it relates to the DOM or elements in the DOM, but in general as well, event handlers are basically functions that when a specific type of event happens, these functions get invoked, these functions get called. So if I click on a button, that's an event. The user did something. I can respond to that event by assigning a function to that type of event, right? So someone clicked, that function will fire. I now can do something, right? That's all we're doing is we're quote unquote handling that event. We're handling the fact that someone did something. We're responding to that, right? And there's text. All right, sorry, lost myself here. The basic concept is what I just said. There's lots of different types of events. Like I said, there's click. There's also key presses. There are.
When you hover over something.
Yep. That's mouse over, like a mouse over event. So in CSS, you'd say like :hover. That's like that mouse. Oh, you're mousing over this event or this over this element. There's touch events. There's scroll events. When the page load, there's a load event, so you can respond to things that way. And they all basically have this same pattern. So let me go back to here and we'll just put something into the DOM real quick. In fact, I'll write a script so we have access to it. So we'll just create a button and inject into DOM. So we'll save our button equals, everyone remembers this, right? So we're just creating a new button. Do I need to make this larger?
No, I needed to put my glasses on.
Oh. So
I think it was a little larger. I mean, I can see it.
let me do this. We'll go down a line and we'll just first make sure my comments are in order.
Yeah. You put the last one in the Slack, right?
He did.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, you can get the clean code.
So now we'll drop it into the document. The document. We got a pen child. And we'll place in our button. There's a button there. Can't really see it very well. I've got this green zoom bar, but there's a button. Let's place some text into that button.
You might be able to hit command plus on that side of the screen.
We'll see it a little bit better now. So there's another method that DOM elements have that are able to receive, like you could call it children, but there's also one called inner text. Oh, I should just refresh this because now I've got two of them. So now we see this button here. Look at me. it doesn't really do much, right? We're not handling any responses or any events. So what we can do now, it's another way to fool your users into thinking something's going on. Don't do that. That's terrible behavior. Terrible behavior. Just log out all the responses out to the console. They'll never know. So now if I say button dot on click, so this is one method available to DOM elements that have a click event. We're going to set that equal to a function. This is our event handler function. So we're going to assign an event handler function a click event handler function. I wish this could move, but it's okay. There we go. So we're going to assign this click event handler. Now what this gets passed is an event object. We're not really going to do anything with that right now. It's just a button click. So really not much happening. Now we just need to decide what we want to do. So I could alert. Can I see alert yet?
Yeah.
Okay, so if I run this, I click it, I have responded to that event. You clicked me. Super useful. You should put that on every single web page ever. Or just place it on various text. And when you click on it, you'll see, oh, you clicked me. But that's another good thing. So anything that can accept a click handler, you can place it on there, like a paragraph tag, a div, not just buttons, not just things you expect to click. Anchor tags, like links to other documents, can also receive there. So when you click a link, there's kind of like a built-in event handler that says, hey, this was clicked. Go to the URL that was specified in the href property, right? Yes. I will eventually, yes, unless you want me to do. No.
Well, if you have to get rid of it, then it's not.
Oh, I'm not going to get rid of it just yet.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, all right. Yeah, before you do it.
Yep. We'll keep all of our event handler stuff here.
Okay.
Let me just make sure I'm on track with my notes.
Can you go where you find the
I'm sorry.
new arrows?
New array.
Yeah.
Oh, that was bad. I posted that in the.
Oh, so you
In-
got rid of that.
Yeah, I got rid of that, but I put it in Slack
Okay, so now it's.
so that so there's a code snippet down here that has all that stuff. Oh, the stuff's still commented out. I can edit that though, so that you have that. We'll focus on this. But just to kind of show you here, so we're going to create paragraph. RP equals document.create element. p.intertext.
Yeah, you have to refresh.
Paragraph. Yeah, you're gonna have like, if you keep clicking that, you're gonna have like 1,000 buttons on there, and well, but you might also get 1,000 alerts that you'll have to dismiss. Yeah. Show 1,000 alerts and programmatically click them away.
Just make a whole page buttons, and then every button you click is
Or every button you click generates a new button that throws up.
I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna send it as a Christmas card. I'm gonna send it to all my family. Never ending Christmas card.
So.
You'll never be able to get out.
So now we have this. Now we have this paragraph. Now we can assign event handlers to this as well. Same way that we have on click. There's different things we can do here as well. So we could say I believe it's on mouse over. This also takes an event. There's really not much in this event object useful to us right now, but just know that some sort of event object is being passed to it. My next example will show the value of that. So in here, every time we mouse over it, we'll console.log paragraph. Moused over. We'll say hovered over. Look in our console. Every time I hover over it, right? So that it's responding to that event. There's lots of events. We could spend all week just going over all of them. There's a lot. But I just want to show you the concept of this. As long as you understand this concept and this pattern, the only thing you need after that is MDN, event handler. Right, so maybe this isn't.
Put the message in the part where they get this paragraph into the Word document. If you want.
Or, here, let me show one more thing. Say MDN on mouse move. Sure, on mouse move. Right. So just by going to one of these, you'll have access to all the other ones. There's a lot. On input, we're actually going to go over next. There's on error, on click, on cancel, on blur, and on focus. So when an element receives focus, when you say click into an input box, that on focus event happened. When you click outside that input box or whatever that has focus, that's the on blur event. So you can respond to every single type of event that happens on the page. Every key press, you can do something as well.
So sometimes when you go to like input boxes and it will say into your name, it will actually have it in the box. And when you click inside of that box, all of that hopeful text disappears. So that's an on focus.
That's a placeholder attribute, right? So if there's nothing in there, that there's no value in there, it'll just show the placeholder text. That's actually an HTML attribute. Yep. So another really neat thing about that, we'll go over input boxes next, because input boxes, you're going to see a lot. Forms are everywhere. In fact, most of our apps at work are either forms or reports. So we kind of joke around, it's like, oh, what form are we creating now? But we need user input for various things, right? And you're always going to want user input. So here we'll create an input element. Let's see that. Our input equals document.create element of type input. And then we'll say, we'll just throw it in there for now. So we'll say document.body.append child input. Now we have this input box. I can type in here, and that's fine, but we're not doing anything, right? So the input box has an event handler called on input function. And now we actually want to care about this event object that's being passed in. So there's a lot of useful things on this event object. Let's do this. Let's console log the actual event object out. So every time I type in here, helps if I log. Well, what happened there? Console.log. There we go. Here's what we see. This is what gets passed to your event handler function every time. A lot of stuff. So this looks really useful. There's some data. The input type, we inserted text. I'm not sure what is composing. I've never seen that before. That's okay. We know the type of the element that was inputted. It's an input. There's also a target. This target is an actual reference. See how I'm hovering over it? The target is the actual element that was interacted with. And that's an important one to know about. Because that target, all the way down in all the properties, all the way down, has a value. And that's what we want out of an input box. 99 times out of 100. Yes.
You put the handler on top of the actual code to create the input box. So I'm noticing that the order doesn't actually matter. I thought that was kind of strange that you did that.
Oh, like this?
Right. The input. You put the.
So right here, I'm
that's
I'm
what it is.
creating the
I'm
input.
sorry, I thought it was the one after it.
Oh, no, sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I'll have to create it first, and then I can actually start putting things on
Okay.
it. Yep.
All right. Sorry about this.
All right, so now, every time we type, well, it's actually not showing anything. We get this event.
Good work. You did it for every letter.
Every single input event, yes. But that's useful because now we can do really neat things. So I'm gonna take, so that we're not creating these things over and over and over again. All right, so now we have that out of the way. Where am I? Right here. So if I run this, if I refresh, I should just see that. Excellent. Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you bring it up in the console again?
The event?
Yeah, like. And is it taking yours one letter at a time?
Right, so you'll notice that, actually I'm gonna do this. Instead of logging the event itself, the event object has a target property that represents the input element itself. And that input element has a value. So now, when I type in here, I'm just console logging the value. Right? Every time you type it, this is going to log out that value. And that value is every character that's in there at the time that that event happens. Right?
But when you just had console log the event, you were taking that whole.
I was logging out the event, the object that represents the event that happened. And on that event, we can focus on what that actual element was that we interacted with. That's our target. And the target has all the attributes that that input element would be able to give you: the name, the ID, the value, things like that. And you're gonna see that when we get to even the framework stuff. So if you create, it's not enough just to create input boxes in a form. You need the values that come out of that, so you can save it somewhere, send it off, display other things on the screen because of it, which actually gets me to my next thing I want to show. So if we have this input, and that's great, but let's say, as the user types, we also want to display that information elsewhere, not just in the console. So I'm going to create just a paragraph. And then we'll put that in the DOM as well. Oh, actually, what we'll do is we'll give this an ID. We'll say paragraph.id. Actually, we'll use the method we used before. Attribute ID, set that equal to message. And then we'll plug that into the DOM. You can see this is very tedious to type all this stuff out. So when we get to like the framework stuff, you're like, oh, I don't have to type all that stuff anymore. Just give me one of these things and it does it for you and you'll rejoice. So,
Are
right,
you gonna be teaching us that?
yes.
Not this week.
No, that's in August.
Oh, oh.
Frameworks, we'll get to.
You have to put the little quotes around the page.
Do we go
inside
into
the- Oh, you did already.
Yep. So we're giving it an ID and a message. Now, if we look at our elements, there's our message. Here's our input. Fantastic. Message doesn't display anything. That's going to change. So every time this event happens, we want to say, since we have reference to P or to this paragraph, we could say inner text equals that event's target's value. Refresh this. So now if I start typing, changing the value inside that paragraph tag. Everyone understand how that's working? I'm sorry? No? Okay. So once I start, if I just type my name, this event object, every time I type a character, this function gets called because we're responding to that on input event. It gets passed an event object that represents the entire event. And that event has a target value, which represents the element that was targeted, which happens to be the input. And then we're grabbing the value property off of that element, and we're assigning that value to the inner text of something else. So that's how we're getting to this. Another way we could write this is our input value equals this. And then we could say p dot inner text. Actually, let's do it this way. We'll say document dot
Oh, that's cool.
query selector. We want the message, right? We want the inner text of that thing equal the input value.
So you're actually typing into the box, the input box, right?
Yep.
I'm just trying to.
I'm typing into the box.
Right, you're typing into the box.
Oops. Helps if I spell things right. Right. So now
So you're typing into the box.
Typing
it's
into the
going
box.
body of the web page.
it's going into the inner text of the paragraph tag with the ID of message. Right. So now if I look in my elements, the inner text of this element is now whatever I typed in. And we can see that in real time in here.
Okay.
Chrome is awesome like that. So you could just hover over things and you can see exactly where it is.
I'm missing some code.
I'm sorry?
I'm missing some code.
You're missing some code.
Yeah.
Let's grab a shovel and dig it out. Which part are we missing?
Put it in
So,
Slack.
when you created the P element, I have the P. I'm missing the other prime.
Oh, let's go up here.
So do you have document create element P?
Okay, so no messages from there. All right. Does this make sense so far? So this is the pattern. This is the event handler pattern. Respond to an event, do something with it. Right? There's, like I was saying before, there is a slew of events. I'd like to go over a majority of them, but in the interest of time, but just know that this pattern is basically the same for each one of those, right? Here's the event object. Let's do something with it. There's one other thing I do want to cover with events, and it's something called event propagation. So if I have, let's say I have a div and I have a button inside that div, and I set a click handler on both the div and the button. Whichever one I click, you would so if I click the div, you would expect that the click handler assigned to the div will fire. And then if I click the button, the click handler on the button will also fire. Now, let me say that again. Let me actually just put this out. let me save this off.
Does the click actually even reach the button since the div is surrounding?
You're on the right track. You're on the right track. So basically what happens is if you, it's so close. So let me just save this off here. All right, so if I'm gonna try to do this as quickly as possible, just to show the illustration of this. So var div equals document. I can't wait till we get to the framework stuff. Let me tell you. And then we're gonna say now we have a div. We're gonna say var button equals. Let's be smart about this. I have a div and a button, and then I'm going to say div.append child button and document.body tag. So now the button is inside the div. Div's now going to be in the body. But let's give some styles to this so we can actually see them, because divs are like invisible things. Almost had it. Blue. So now we have that, and then the button will also have some inner text. Because that's exactly what it is. Now we have a button and a div, right? We'll give a click handler to the div. We won't worry about the event, but I'll put it there anyway, so you know it's there. And we'll just say console.log clicked div. We'll do the same thing for the button. And I'll paste this in. This is just to illustrate the point. I click the div, I click the div. Happens when I click the button. I click the button first, but that event, quote unquote, bubbled up to its parent. And it will keep going until it gets to the window. So you can have event handlers on every single element. You can put a click event on every single element, and you click the innermost one, every single one of those is going to fire. That may not be exactly what you want, right? So maybe you want to stop what it's doing. So when I click maybe I want the button to be clicked, but I don't want the div to actually be clicked at the same time I click the button, but I still want people to be able to click the div, just not at the same time as they click the button. So there's this thing called stop propagation, which means when it gets to this point, it's not going to go any further. So it's going to kind of cancel that bubbling up effect so that you can prevent the click handlers from happening. And that's on the event object. I believe I put it on the one. So I want a console log, and then I want to, if I remember it correctly, stop propagation. Probably didn't spell that right. Propagation. We click the div. Cool. Click the button. Oh, I got to put on the other one. Or I could have spelled it wrong. One of the two. Div, button. Nope, I didn't. MDN to the rescue. Application. No examples. Oh, it's a function. My bad. Div button. There we go. I wasn't calling it. So that's actually, it's a method that's on the event object, not a property.
And stop propagation is doing what? Oh,
So when I click the button, that event is not going to go anywhere else. Even though I'm clicking on both things at once, right? It's because the button's inside the div. So that's going to register, hey, you clicked inside this thing. All these click handlers are associated with things where you clicked.
So it's stopping one event from happening when it's inside of another event.
Yeah, so what it's doing is that event that's occurring, when it gets to that stop propagation method, nothing else is going to happen. Even if other things are trying to listen for what you're trying to do.
So that event is the stop propagation. Nothing else is gonna happen.
Correct. There's also another one called event.prevent default. So there's default behavior associated with different types of elements. So when you click on a URL, like an anchor tag, the default behavior is for it to follow you over to wherever that resource is. You could say on click event.prevent default. It's not going to go there. It's going to do what you tell it to do next. So it's going to prevent that default behavior from occurring so that you can do something else with it. And that's actually very useful, especially when you have, so for example, we have some components at work that are forms, but we don't want to use the default form behavior of posting to the same page, listening for events. There's default behavior behind forms. We stop that from happening and we do something else with it. So there's different ways that we decide to handle input from forms different from the browser's default behavior, because we don't exactly want that. We want it to go somewhere else. Maybe we don't want it to go to the same page, because when you click on a form, if the default behavior is to go to the same page, it refreshes that page because it's expecting you to handle it when it comes back, right? There's going to be parameters inside your URL at that point. We don't want that. We want a nice user experience where if they click this, we tell it where to go. Right, so we prevent that default behavior from happening, and that would look like, yes, we'll do that. Prevent the default. It's also a method you call it. Right. So I will put some comments around this, post it in Slack, and we'll take, how long do our breaks usually? 15? Okay, so we'll come back at whatever 24 plus 15 is, 39.
Wow.
I don't do math a lot, but when I have to do it on the spot, I try to be correct. So let me,
That's like one thing. You try, you did.
thankfully it was simple math.
You're so high, yeah.
All right, so I'm going to mute this. Mute this. Okay, and we are back. Okay, so we're just almost to 8 o'clock. There was an exercise I wanted to go through regarding where, well, I'll start talking about it. It's going to be, for the rest of this class, it's going to be a little bit less code and more talking about what you're going to be writing, right? So requirements, we're going to talk about requirements, documents, and stuff like that. Because like I was saying yesterday, just get hired somewhere and they're like, okay, go create stuff for us. That would be great because that's awesome. But most of the time they'd be like, hey, we have this specific project. Can you help out with this particular section of the project? And so documentation helps. Now, depending on where you're at, that documentation might be great. It might be not so great. I'm fortunate in that currently we have a lot of documentation for the things that we're building now. We used to not. So when I first started on, there was very little documentation. And since I've been there, our documentation's gotten a lot better. We have a lot more of a focus on that, and it's really showing in our end results. So once you have an outline, even just a guide to where you need to be, right? So if you want to fulfill business requirements, that's why work at a business, there are requirements for things to happen. Sales need to be made, goals need to be met. And we have all these types of applications that allow us to get there. So there are different business requirements for these applications to be built, right? We're not just going to create something because we think it's cool, even though that's really what we want to do. But some of the things we get to work on are really cool. So that's a nice little treat sometimes. And so I'm going to talk about a little project I created specifically for this class. And I'm going to give everyone the requirements for building this project. So I was hoping to have a little bit more time today to go over this, but that's okay. We can actually use part of tomorrow as well. Tonight's homework will be just a little bit lighter than it will be, I think, than it was originally going to be. So you're in luck. But tomorrow's going to be a little bit heavier. So, but anyways, does everyone here's used REPL.it, right? I think you guys used it with Jake. Did everyone feel pretty comfortable with that? Right. So
It lagged a lot for me.
It did? Okay.
Yeah, it lagged, at least at home in the first night of class.
Oh, because you're doing everything. Well, even if it's remote, it's still the connection there.
Yeah, I was able to keep up with it just by refreshing my screen constantly. So I worked around it.
All right, so we're going to visit REPL. Actually, before we visit REPL, I'm going to do one thing. We're going to go to github.com/hackupstate. So if y'all want to go here. Now you guys use the Careers in Code sandbox,
Yeah.
right, to upload some of your stuff with Gus, I believe. Have you used it since then, or was it only Gus was utilizing it? Only Gus? Okay. I did upload some stuff into here. It's the same stuff that you're going to see in REPL, simply because REPL will give us a little bit more of a chance to collectively code, right? Rather than just following along and hoping that you got it, which is totally fine too if that's the way you learn best. So up to you. All I ask is that if you are going to follow along with the REPL when we start getting into the coding aspect of it, most likely it's going to be more of like tomorrow's beginning section. We'll talk a little bit lecture style, just a little bit, and then we'll get right into some coding tomorrow to kind of make up for today. So if you're going to follow along with REPL, all I ask is that you actually contribute some code, right? So, which is really a good way to practice, right? So hopefully you won't feel too pressured about anything. Don't worry, we'll try not to get too hung up on certain things. I'll definitely help move everything along. But I want to make sure that everyone that does follow with that gets a chance to code. right? But if you're the type that wants to, I mean, I would encourage you to do it, but if you want to just follow along on your own, more than welcome to pull this repo, pull the latest from this down and work on it locally as well. So if you go to the sandbox, careers and code sandbox, you'll see a folder with my name on it. The commit says added exercise material for week 9. And you'll see 2 folders. The ES6 folder we'll talk about tomorrow and Friday, or sorry, tomorrow and Thursday. Surprise, you're here Friday. Just kidding. And then the other one is called Tiny FEF, which stands for Tiny Front End Framework. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a tiny front end framework. So in order to do that, we're not just say, okay, let's build this thing on a whim, right? So when you're building something like a front end framework, you need some direction, right? What's the purpose of this thing, or even just what should be created? What's going to be inside this? The business requirement says TBD because I wasn't sure how I wanted to approach it. I wanted to get a feel for everything, but for the sake of time, instead of just updating this here, we're going to say the business requirements is that we want to provide a small front end framework so that people can create user interfaces. Plain and simple. It's really tiny. Takes up not a lot of space, and it's a pattern that's repeatable. In fact, I'll probably just update the GitHub later tonight with that info as well. The technical requirements are really what we're interested in today, today and tomorrow, because this is what needs to be created in order for this tiny front end framework to function properly. So we'll just go through some of the requirements real quick. So the tiny front end framework API, who remembers what API stands for? You got 2/3 of it. Programming interface. Yep. For the longest time, I kept forgetting what A meant. Like, well, application, that's pretty easy. It's if you just look at it, take off the I, app, application, that's how I remembered it. It should be a globally accessible object and implement as its properties the following functions. So what that means is that if we are I'm just gonna open up the console real quick. If we're in the console and we type tiny FEF, you can see I was practicing. That should be a global object in my global scope. I should have access to properties on this object, and the properties are create element. You can kind of guess what that's going to do, right? It's going to accept 3 parameters. If you remember the square brackets in the signature, these are optional. So has 3 parameters, 2 are optional. The required one is the type. And so now if we look right here, it says creates either an element of that's incorrect grammar. Creates an element of the type passed to it. I was typing slower than I was thinking. So type is a string that represents the element to be created. So if we remember, create element takes a string, even in the DOM API. Options is optional, but if you pass it, it's an object that represents the attributes that will be applied to this element. So if you remember, we did set attribute, style with like background color blue, so on and so forth. Also, options could also accept event handlers as well. It's also an attribute. So if I look at a button, it may have an attribute of ID, and maybe that's set to my button, but it also has an attribute of on click. That attribute is also an event handler. So this should be able to accept that as well. And then the third optional parameter is children. So this is either an element, a string, or an array of elements or strings to be rendered as children of this element. So if you remember, append child would probably be useful in this situation. And there's some other requirements around this one. And this is why I wanted to touch on iteration, because you're going to see this a lot in front-end frameworks. So if you're passing an array, only the elements of that array will be rendered. So that's a requirement. So if I pass an array plus other stuff, we only care about the array, and all subsequent elements will be ignored. This is 1 to make sure we follow the requirements, and two, to simplify this thing. So we don't want to have too much complex logic in here. It is, after all, a tiny front end framework. So for everyone that just came in, if you go to github.com/hackupstate and look at the Careers and Code sandbox repo that you were using with Gus, you'll see.
Slash careers and coding.
Yeah, so
Copy and pasted the link.
you did.
Slack if they
Excellent.
just get it from there.
Yep, just click on that. You'll take you right to the folder where we're at.
Oh, can I make a quick announcement?
Yeah.
Jesse got back to me about Memorial Day and said that yes, we do have it off.
Okay.
I just want to make sure. I did.
May 27th.
Yes.
Couple weeks from
Monday.
now.
It's always the last Monday of May, I think.
Yeah, I was just kind of like,
I actually proposed to my wife Memorial Day Eve, so I'll always remember that day. It's very memorable. It's
What's Memorial Day? I'm sorry.
May 27th.
No,
This
no,
is
what
a
is it?
holiday.
It doesn't take off from work.
It's
voluntary.
It's Memorial to fall.
The cookout will be at your house. I'll be there. Chauffeur.
My house.
Everybody off.
that was the difference. I couldn't remember the difference. That was it.
What, between Memorial and Veterans Day?
Yeah, that's, see, there's a lot of.
Veterans are not necessarily.
I'm still alive. That's right. Yeah.
All right. So is everyone at the Tiny.
Oh, tiny. oh.
So inside the Joey Buczek folder, you'll see tiny FEF,
Yeah.
tiny front end framework, and then there.
Mhm.
Not the LG.
No, go back.
You're right, right here. This is what we're looking at. Go back. We're just looking at this stuff right here. Oh.
By default, it should show you the contents of the README.
Thank you.
Yep, if you just scroll down just a little bit, you'll see. We briefly touched on business requirements, the business requirements for this tiny front-end framework that we'll be building between tonight and tomorrow, mostly tomorrow. We'll just go through these documents. It's so that we're creating this tiny little front-end framework so that people can create user interfaces with a repeatable pattern, right? So something that once you get the pattern down, you can create everything else very easily, but we're doing it very small. We're only going to implement a few things. The first thing we'll implement is this create element method. And it accepts 3 parameters, 2 of them optional. So just a quick recap here. The first parameter, which is required, is a type. So this is a string that represents the element that we'll be creating in the DOM. Options is an object that represents all the attributes that we can apply to that element in the DOM. So an ID, an event handler like on click or on input. This default, I forgot to mention this, but this defaults to an empty object, and we'll see ways that we can handle default values inside parameters. The quote unquote default value of all parameters, if you give it nothing, is the value of undefined. If you guys went over undefined. So it's a value that represents no value. That's it. They could have called it no value, but yeah. Very technical. It's undefined. We did not define it. But it actually is a value itself. It's really weird. It's a value that represents no value. And then children is the optional parameter, the third parameter. And that takes either an element, a string, or an array of elements or strings. You can see it can actually accept multiple things. So we'll need logic to handle the type of value that's being passed into here. And those are going to be rendered as the children of this element that we're creating. If you pass an array, only the elements of that array will be rendered. All subsequent elements passed after that will be ignored. These children are appended in the order that they are given. So if you give it an array of elements, they will be appended to that parent element in the order that they're in the array. That will make more sense when thinking about like for each and mat, right? The order that it goes through everything. We want to pay attention to that. And an element should render as elements, and strings should render as text nodes. So if it finds an element, it injects it as an element. If it finds a string, it should create a text node and render that. Right? And then our other main method is the render method that takes two required parameters, or it has two required parameters, element and target ID. So this renders an element in the browser window as children of the element whose ID attribute is given as the second argument. I will rephrase that. It will take element and append it as a child of the element that has this ID in it. So the target ID is an ID of some existing element somewhere in the page. We could just call it, maybe it's the ID is app. We would find that element that has app and append this element as the child. That's how we get it into the DOM, right? And then the parameters explain that as well. The top level element to be rendered in the DOM, top level will make more sense in a little bit. And then target ID is the ID of an existing element in the DOM, where the element argument will be rendered as a child. Just another way of saying that. So all of the above functions should be defined on an object that represents tinyFEF as a whole. So if I go into the console, and this should be globally accessible, if I type tinyFEF, I'm not going to do anything now, of course, but what I should expect when I type that is an object with two methods on it, create element and render. So those are the hard requirements. We have to have those in order for this product to be successful. All right, and then there's also optional features. So there's also an optional method called update element that takes an element and some options and updates those attributes within that element. And there's also some element helpers down here as well. So we can specifically create divs, p tags, italic elements, or buttons, right? Those are just helpers. Whereas create element is more of a generic thing. We can create any element, but sometimes maybe we want a helper, right? And those are all optional. So by following these requirements, we now have a good sense of how we're going to be creating this thing. So there's this company out there called Tiny Company, and they're looking for this tinyFEF product, and they want to hire you. So if you create this for them, in exchange, they will hire you full-time, awesome benefits, and you'll be able to work remotely from any place in the world. So that is the motivation behind creating this thing. If only, right? So imagine white sand beaches, sand inside your keyboard, not so fun. All right, don't code on the beach. Don't do it. It's just a mess. Yeah, you pretty much have to toss your laptop after that. Experience. All right, so. All right, so when we render this, what should it look like? What should this do, right? So you'll see some files in here. So we see the README, we just went over that. We see homepage. This was provided by the company, Tiny Company. This is what should be output to the DOM when this product successfully runs and actually renders stuff. So to see this, we'll get to that in just a second, but we're going to go back and we're going to look at some other stuff. So index.html represents where all this stuff is going to happen. This is your base HTML document that you need to have this tiny front-end framework injected stuff into. All right, so you can see we already have a div in here with an ID of app. So that could be useful, right? We'll need to include our tiny front-end framework library object here. And then we also see there's this script that they've provided for us, so this index.js. Let's take a look at that. So as you can see here, when you have properly created the tinyFEF create element and render methods, the below code should produce elements in the browser window. So when this code runs, this is going to look like a bunch of gibberish right now, but when this code runs, we're going to see what we see in that homepage HTML document, which we'll show in just a moment. So that's what we need to do. So our tiny front end framework, as you can see even here, on line 19, we're pulling out the create element as a reference. So we don't have to keep typing tinyfef.create element over and over and over and over again. Because if you remember something about functions, functions can be passed and stored as values. So a function can be stored inside a variable, and now that variable basically represents that function. You can call it. So this is another way of saving basically keystrokes, and you keep your files a little bit smaller because you're not typing as much, and it's much more enjoyable to work with instead of having to type all that out all the time. And then we can also see down on line 52, we're calling the render method. We're passing in a reference to app, which is defined on line 20. That represents the app that was tinyfef will create. And looks like our target, we are going to use that target ID, that app ID for that div, right? And you'll notice down here, there's just some code that says if tinyfef is not defined, if it's not as this object, it's just going to console log that says it's not implemented yet. And we'll see that in just a moment. All right, so there's just a couple other things in here. There's a tinyfef logo. Looks like they've already created this logo, so we can use that. We don't have to create one from scratch. You can thank Microsoft Word for that. And then, or actually, technically pages inside the Mac. And then there's also this tinyfef.js that could be useful. All right, so it looks like they've already given us a head start. So we need to configure the globally accessible object variable tinyfef. And it looks like they already have something in there. It's just an about. So apparently that's the version they want us to start out as. So as a whole, these are all of our requirements. We have to create this thing. And once it's created, you get to live wherever you want in the world and code for tiny company for fantastic benefits. All right, that is your motivation. Any questions on, well, I guess, what are some questions that you may have? Maybe technical documentation questions, or why would things happen this way, or anything like that? Any questions?
The app, what does that do?
In index.js? I'm sorry, where? There's a couple references to app.
Yeah, let me. Oh, it was render app and index.js, but that's just a function that you create.
That's a function that you'll have to implement.
Okay.
Well, we'll implement it together. Or you can all do this for homework tonight. We'll go through it all together. All right, so we cool with the requirements that need to be done? Seems pretty straightforward. All right, so we're gonna head over to, I'm sorry. Yep. That's why. But remember how yesterday I noticed that MDN was a great resource for maybe getting documentation ideas from? So when building this, I basically went to MDN and copied their style and threw it into here, right? It's a little bit different than what we use at work. At least for our technical requirements, they're a little bit more drawn out than this. But it's great. So now if you go to MDN and you're looking for maybe some syntax help on some methods that you may want to use, at least you know the styles match up, so it becomes familiar, right? You're going to notice that patterns creep up all over the place in programming, even in documentation. When you recognize patterns, it's extremely helpful. All right, so everyone jump over to repl.it. Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll just copy this and put it in Slack. I'll save you the time. All right, so everyone go to the link I just posted in Slack. Everyone's there? You should see all the same files that are in the GitHub repo. So you can click on each one and see everything here. Okay. So they gave us this homepage.html document. This is what we need to have. This is what they want to see when they run the code that's inside index.js that utilizes this little framework object that we're going to create. So to see this, real quickly, let's go over to index.html. And I'm going to hit oh, how did you guys do this before? Did he have to invite every single one of you?
You just have to turn on multiplayer.
Okay. And then did he have to invite you?
Some kind of link.
A link, maybe to share? This seems to be just this one. That's okay. I'll figure it out so that we can all do this together as we go through it tomorrow, because we are getting close to the end of class today. So for now, inside your index.html, let me turn this part off. Inside index.html, oh, actually you see here where it says, actually I already put this helper in. On line 11 of index.html, you'll see an anchor tag, which references over to homepage.html. Click here to see final result. So if you just click the run button up top, you should see the link. Click on that. This is what your tiny front-end framework is going to produce from the code they gave us. So you can see there's a button on here. We can see there's a subscribe button. It looks like it just says it wants to subscribe with, I'm guessing it's going to be an email. So it's an email@email.com. All right, so that's all it's doing. It's just alerting us that we're subscribed. There's a getting started button that takes us over back to the repo. All right, so there's some functionality in here. Nothing crazy, but there is functionality. And if we look at the console tab, remember how I said there was that little where it says not implemented? So tinyFEF is not yet implemented. So this code ran and says, hey, this isn't implemented yet. Our goal is to replace this with this result. All right, so that's going to be, that's our requirements. Any questions on any of this? Are we good? All right, so what I would do is for tonight, well, basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna encourage you all to look through this and then use MDN as a reference to maybe catalog some of the things that you might want to implement with this. We are gonna implement this together. So just go through and think about, based on these requirements, like, okay, so create element. What are methods that I can use inside this method? Obviously, we're abstracting away this whole element creation thing. So what are methods and different types of maybe iteration I can use to handle this, right? So we're passing in options. It seems like it's an object, so we should be able to get all the key value pairs out of this thing. So we have to iterate over that somehow. So think about those. Also with render, how do we get stuff into the DOM? Maybe just write down all the things that you think should be in here. And then we'll go from there. Right? And if you're feeling really sassy and you want to try something else for homework, I'll post something else. But you don't have to do it tonight. We'll get to some of that stuff later on as well. All right, but get familiar with whatever's here. Write some documentation to yourself, even if it's just in some text file or in a notepad or something, about what you think should be in here. And maybe some of the things that maybe you're struggling with that we can try to implement in this as we go to really hammer home those ideas, right? So that's your main homework. Nothing necessarily coding wise. I'll put an optional homework in if you really want some other stuff, and I won't put the due date for tomorrow. So if you're like, okay, I think I've got everything I need, I want something else to do, you'll have something else to do. I love how people laugh at that. It's great. So before before we stop the stream and everything, any final questions for today or any thoughts you want to share on today? Or maybe things you really want to see us go over tomorrow? Okay.
Prototypes, I'm just.
I think it helps to go back over the loops like we did today.
That was helpful.
So it's helpful a lot.
Excellent. We are going to talk about prototypes.
Can we do it again?
Oh, you did it already?
Hmm,
You talking about
I
prototypes?
think we touched on it, but.
Touched on it?
Not actually,
Yeah.
did it.
Okay.
And he said stay away from
Yes, of course he did.
it.
And I'm going to tell you the same
Wait,
thing.
why? Wait, what? You
Um,
I just had a quick question for mess around and example. They have like tests, like assignments, whatever, however you want to call it, that are ready that you would recommend to be players and take and.
In REPL,
Mhm.
I haven't actually gone through them, but I would recommend go through any of them that you feel like you want to take on. I've only used REPL once before, and they didn't have the functionality of like the multiplayer stuff when I used it. But now that they have it, I want to explore it more. So yeah, there's another tool that I'm going to introduce to you guys when we get to the front end framework module that is extremely helpful. I use it all the time. But it's geared towards the front end frameworks. It's not geared towards little things like this.
Right
So-
now, we're like doing the back end, a little bit front end. Just say like,
Yeah, so we're still in the front end right now, but you can kind of think of this as back end logic, right? So we have an interface. We have this tiny FEF object that has some methods on it. So the front end part, you could think about, I mean, technically it all is in front end, but when looking at tiny front end framework, we could say, well, our front end are these methods that we can call, and the back end is the logic that happens underneath that makes the stuff happen that we can see, right? If you think about it that way, then that would be valid. Yep. But typically when you hear back end, it's usually like server side stuff. Like you'll learn more about Node.js. That's back end server side type stuff. Or if you're at a company like Raymore, we use Microsoft products for our backends. We use Microsoft MVC and .NET Core, all Microsoft products.
when you say use Microsoft, it's like more the queries and like database, maintaining the database. Right?
Yeah, so the database is even another, we don't use Microsoft databases, so to speak, although we use Microsoft tools to get to databases. So the databases that we use are like SQL Server, Oracle, and those are our main ones. But like for the quote unquote backend, that's Microsoft MVC framework, right? These are tools that we use to generate applications or web applications or whatever. Yeah. It's just another tool.
And I think
I'm going to let you guys know as soon as I hear. Yeah, so as soon as I have info, I'll share that with you guys. Absolutely. Like I was saying before, we have no shortage of work to do. I think Dakir remembers that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
All right, so yeah, so I guess we'll end it here. Go home, read through this stuff. I'll post an optional homework if you feel like doing some other things as well. And then we'll see y'all tomorrow.
Thank you.